As the years have gone by, I seem to have gotten further and further away from any coverage of modern games. Once in a blue moon you may get something, although usually it'll be highly retro-tinged indeed. I've gotten more and more into what's truly old, it seems. But I do still play new things, as it happens. I'm not entirely stuck to a ZX Spectrum. And well, a decade has ended. A whole 10 years, believe it or not. It feels wrong to not put a bow around it in some way. And so, having said I was going to leave doing these big lists for a while, I've decided to make another big list for my top 50 games of the 2010s. Now this decade was the one where I finally and pretty much totally gave myself over to PC gaming. I don't really do modern consoles all that much now, it must be said. So in order to simplify things a little, this is entirely a Steam list. All of these games are PC titles, although some I may have played originally on another machine. There's a few games that could have made it, that have been omitted as a result, but it's still a pretty fine representation of the games that I utterly loved back in the 2010s. So, yeah, let's do this, without any further ado, or something like that. Nidhogg is a strange opener, a sort of sword fighting game that has this quite specific set of rules, but is still more than a little chaotic. It plays like Joust on foot, where these fast little fights are won via getting your sword higher than the opponent's, but then plain fighting isn't the way you properly win. You have to get to the opponent's end of the stage. Sometimes instead of actually trying to fight, something that happens so quickly as to almost be random, you may just want to kick the enemy's sword away and run past him. Perhaps you may surprise the enemy by chucking your sword at him, or see if you can get him to fall through a gap. There's plenty of ways to skin a cat here, or rather skewer it with a sword. The broken Atari 2600 vibe and somewhat odd music also make this enticing, more so than the somewhat plainer sequel anyway. And it's a lot of fun with friends. Simple way to start the top 50. Who doesn't love a bit of Trials? Again, it's quite simple, or at least it seems that way. Here's a bike. Shift yourself to the left and right, make some jumps, perhaps do a wheelie, maybe the odd flip or two, and have fun. Easy enough. Of course, there's a lot of intricacies. The finer points of bunny hopping and hill climbing are nothing to be sniffed at, but it's still plenty of fun for someone who isn't good at these things, like me. Trials Evolution is still for me the perfect Trials package. Later games like Fusion and Rising possibly just got a bit too bloated for their own good, as well as frankly being utter dogs to play on a PC. But this? Well, you get a spruced up warehouse from the very first HD Trials game, lots more great levels besides that, and the usual fun mini-games. Every bit of it is filled with that classic Trials action that you'd expect whether you've just picked it up or you've been playing since the Flash days. Red Lynx nailed it right here in 2012, and to be honest, they've not come close to it since then. A very recent addition to the list, this one, but hardly unworthy. Gris, a game by Spanish studio Nomada, is, well, obviously it's beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful games ever made. It's perfectly animated, hand-drawn wonder. Those graphics are certainly the main pull of it. There's a nice, simple bit of actual game here too. A less hardcore and much more simple puzzle-type platformer that's never all that taxing, nor does it have any desire to be at all. The visuals and presentation are probably strong enough to keep most people going, even if the art house style story doesn't necessarily grab them. Gris is a slight game in most every area except for one, but that's a very big one indeed, and that style alone makes it worth sticking with right to the finish. Bloody Nora, this game is fun. Broforce. There's many a game that can be considered a big and loud tribute to all things 80s and retro and actiony, and none more so than this one perhaps. Huge cigar-chomping generals, endless terrorists and crackpot leaders to kill, a whole troop of barely disguised action heroes and heroines. Sometimes games like this aren't quite as exciting as the premise, but not so here. Broforce is absolutely chaotic. Even the slightest shot can sometimes cause a ludicrous chain reaction of blocks crashing everywhere, fuel canisters shooting off and setting enemies on fire, bridges smashed with people fall into the abyss, and usually you're right in the middle of the whole lot. The game may have a retro style, but the actual play is anything but. Newfangled and modern as hell, always fresh as endless bros get shoved in your hands at random. It kicks a very serious amount of arses. In the days before a proper spiky blue hedgehog came roaring back into view, a lot of people looked to this game, Freedom Planet, as kind of like the 2D Sonic Sega Saturn game we never ended up getting, especially because it did start out as a Sonic fan game. However, the game isn't all the way exactly like Sonic. It takes elements from many a classic 16-bit platformer, from Rocket Knight Adventures to Y-Star. While it also has a somewhat cringy plot that ends up taking longer to go through than many of the actual levels that a segment of it precedes, fortunately the option is provided to not bother with any of that, and is highly recommended. Just get on with the game because it's excellent. If it had come out in the late 90s, it would be a classic. The similar brilliance of Sonic Mania and the long amount of time it's taken for the game's sequel to arrive has perhaps meant that Freedom Planet has been a little forgotten. But the 6-year wait for said sequel is due to finally be over this year, so perhaps people might remember just how bloody cracking this game is once more. It's Kangaro's To the Moon. I did a review of this many years ago, when it really took my fancy. A simple RPG maker game featuring the story of an old dying man and his desire to have memories implanted in his brain of being an astronaut, complete with themes of Asperger's syndrome, reconnection and, naturally, a look at the doctors who are doing the deed. This is sort of like the drugs don't work of indie games. The one that's going to get big red-blooded men all properly teary-eyed as they connect with all of its big and quite universal brushstrokes like Living for Today and all that sort of thing. The style of a classic 90s RPG is used for a point-and-click adventure that certainly does tell quite an affecting little story. Now, I always have to have a very simple cue sports game to hand. Sometimes I really don't want much more than to just knock some balls around a table. For me, Pool Nation is still the absolute best to be found on Steam. While it's not as complex as, Virtual Pool 3, it still has plenty of different pool modes, people to play against, tables to play on, a free play trick-shot mode a la Jimmy White, and it caters to just about everyone from the most casual of players to someone who'd rather play with no assistance at all. It's the sort of game I'll happily play a couple of frames of, just 15 minutes or so here and there. It's just a shame it doesn't have any kind of snooker mode, I guess. That'd be jolly fun to screw around with. Or hey, how about billiards? If the folks behind this decided to stick those into a sequel, I'd probably never bother with getting another Q Sports game. The reaction to this game was quite simple, at least from anyone who wasn't already familiar with how good Sega's take on kart racing was. Oh look, here's Sega ripping off Mario Kart, bloody typical. Oh hey, Sumo Digital are in charge of this, it might be alright. Bloody hell, this game's fantastic. All Stars Racing Transformed shoves you in planes, automobiles and boats, throws endless tracks of Sega-based nostalgia at you, and provides, well, the best kart racing experience I've ever had, that's for sure. It's not exactly my genre of choice, but for me this knocks basically any Mario Kart, with the possible exception of the original, into a cocked hat. It's so much better than any of them, it's not even fair. Everything you could possibly want out of one of these games is here, pretty much. And you even get to play as Alex Kidd. Wonderful. This is certainly one of the more unique games here, that's for sure. I mean, how do you sum up Super Hot? A shooter where nothing moves until you do. Imagine if you were constructing one of those old Flash stick figure fighting animations, only it's guns and it's in 3D. The end result is a ridiculous smooth sequence where you disarm people by throwing guns at them, dodge bullets and effortlessly shoot would-be assassins in the head, Matrix style, but first it has to be constructed, almost frame by frame. It's not really a shooter, it's more of a puzzle game, and as you can see it is as aesthetic as you can possibly get. From the MS-DOS presentation to the old tube monitor emulation, the sea of brilliant white and constant super hot that will embed itself into your brain, there's not much like it at all, and it is short enough that it's almost guaranteed to hook you all the way to the end. Here's our first serious monolith. I've been a bit up and down with Grand Theft Auto 5, it has to be said. Having 3 main characters is great, as is having such a cool city. The plot is probably the worst in any GTA game, with beats that are beyond tired by this point, but it does give us the almighty Trevor Phillips. It lacks some of the finer details and more chaotic points you'd find in GTA 4, a game I actually think a lot better of now, but it does have things like first-person mode. It's more than a bit bloated, but then you would expect a GTA game to be. I don't have any interest in the online mode whatsoever, so we can just ignore that. I still find it fun to occasionally dick around in, although it's not quite on the level of GTA at its peak. But it is still GTA, and I'm always going to be a fan of it somewhat. By this point, it's sort of like seeing your favourite classic rock band, not on a reunion tour, but touring an album that mags call a return to form, or their best work since insert classic album here, which it clearly is not. But as long as they play all the hits well, you're still going to have a lot of fun. A most glorious return indeed. After many years, we finally got the Sonic game that many people wanted in the classic original formula. A lot of that is down to the work of a fan named Christian Whitehead, which kind of validates the entire fan game scene by itself, and the final result is a game that could easily have been the missing link between Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Sonic Adventure, the classic Sonic game on Sega Saturn that never actually happened. But there's more than just nostalgia at work here. Sonic Mania certainly presents you with a lot that's familiar, but then it kicks a lot of those old zones up several notches and makes you legitimately excited and ready to fall in love all over again. At the start of the decade, rhythm games were largely still good clean fun. Hey, let's get a bunch of friends together and play Rock Band. We'll all jam out to some Rush. And what do we have in the genre at the end of the decade? Futuristic, intense oppression. Beat Saber is one thing, of course, it'd be on here if I only had VR, but Thumper is entirely another. Thumper makes your hair stand up to attention. It's all about percussion, every hit of a drum accompanied by a move done at supersonic speed. It is as crazy as it looks, make no mistake. This is the first game that I've played perhaps where I did wonder if I was actually a little too old and doddery for it. Thumper feels like the future, and it turns out that the future is a vicious and cruel place. Who'd have thought, huh? I've never played anything quite like it, so naturally it makes the 50. Back in 2010, when a 2K boss man was quoted as saying that turn-based strategy games weren't contemporary, and cries of "Betrayal!" could be heard in the halls of E3, no one guessed what was going to come a couple of years down the line. It's romantic to think that 2K were inspired to get Firaxis in and actually bring a proper XCOM game back due to the negative reaction previews of their first-person shooter XCOM received, although naturally that's not the case. XCOM Enemy Unknown spent a healthy 4 or so years in development, and the end result was something that brought the vicious old ways back, an unrelenting and stern game where mistakes are severely punished and choices have dire consequences, but not a game that entirely prostrates itself at the foot of the classic original. It has plenty more to add to the formula, that's for sure. Everyone loved this game, and rightly so. Hell, the game's success may have contributed a bit to games gradually becoming a lot less handholdy as the decade wore on. Not bad for something so uncontemporary, really. In a way, Cuphead and Gree, which we saw earlier, are quite similar. They're utterly different just about everywhere, but in both games you can't help but be completely staggered by the presentation. You could make a fair case for either game being the most stunning work of 2D ever created. Cuphead does perhaps give you less time to admire those brilliant classic cartoon aesthetics, mind. You're too busy desperately staying alive. Beating almost any boss in this game feels rewarding, usually because it took a bloody age to finally get everything down. It's one of the most cathartic games to see broken on the knee of someone like, say, the almighty Mexican runner, one of the game's former world record holders. You can't imagine the untold pain and dedication it took to get there. Maybe one day I won't be so terrible at this game, but the class of it is undeniable. It's interesting to look back at Limbo and see the things that made up an absolute indie darling game at the beginning of the decade, as opposed to what makes up one at the end. It's also quite something to think that the game's so close to being 10 years old. But I digress. Limbo is a cinematic platformer, the sort you can trace right back to another world. I'm always a bit surprised by how violent it is. Much like the classic Heart of Darkness, this game possesses a total disregard for our young protagonist's life if you put so much as a foot on. Some things stay the same. Indie darlings always have a pretty strong sense of style, and Limbo's glorious grainy silhouettes are still incredibly pretty nowadays. It's not exactly surprising that the game's held up well, but it has. One of the best entries in a genre that I really do quite enjoy. It seems as though we've had an awfully large amount of really bloody great games in the 2010s. Because of that, it does seem like some legitimately great games, even those that were lauded upon release, seem to get a little forgotten. I'd kind of forgotten about Brothers a little, until playing it again for this video and remembering just how brilliant it was, and also seeing how not many games have really tried to do what it did since. Brothers is all about controlling two people at once with the sticks and shoulder buttons. It's hard to get this down at first, but it becomes second nature quite quickly. Other than that, I'd forgotten about the wonderful detail, how strong the characters and the world is without a single word of English being uttered, and the really quite affecting story. It's a quieter game than a lot of the other more celebrated indie classics that have made this list, but it absolutely deserves to be right alongside them. Here's another game that's perhaps a bit less well known than others here, although it is a simpler affair. Race the Sun is a casual roguelite of sorts. You control a solar powered ship and go through as many zones as you can, and you die either when you collide with something or when the sun sets. Pretty simple. Every 24 hours the layout of the zones changes completely. This is quite cool as it gives you a bit of time to learn a good route that will get you as many points and as much distance as possible, although not all the time in the world to do that. And there's plenty of other little variations nowadays. The game isn't an ultra looker or anything, but it's very clean and smooth, like going through an early 2000s MTV ident. It's a perfect game for short blasts. Seriously, I played it every day for months a few years back. Only ever for about 20 minutes at a time, but I wanted to see what today's layout was and if I could get a good one through the regions. 'Twas a jolly good time. Obsidian got the shitty end of the stick. They inherited an audience that had gorged themselves, Mr. Creosote style, RIP Terry Jones, on years worth of monolithic Bethesda games like Oblivion and Fallout 3. They were stuck with an engine that would keel over and die if you so much as looked at it funny, let alone tried to build on it at all. And eventually, while people liked New Vegas when it came out, a combination of audience fatigue and severe bugs made for a somewhat understated reception, allowing the parent company to stiff Obsidian out of their well-earned bonus due to the Metacritic score not quite being high enough. But in the end, Obsidian had the last laugh. New Vegas is now regarded as something of a classic, the true 3D Fallout with tons of personality that can actually hang with the older games. New Vegas's reputation has gone up almost as much as Fallout 3's has gone down. Whatever little changes Obsidian could make to the worn-out Gamebryo base make for something that does feel different and so much more competent, and makes for a game that's so much more rewarding to just get lost in. It's certainly no glorified epic fetch quest, that's for sure. Oh, and it leaves Fallout 4 coughing up dust in its wake as well. How about some more injustice? We never got a sequel to this. As GTA settled into comfortable if still entertaining laziness, other sandbox games came to take the mantle and, well, do better. Sleeping Dogs was absolutely one of the best attempts. Take everything good about the true crime series a lot of the United Front guys previously worked on, stick it in Hong Kong, base it more around fighting than shooting and make that top notch, add a genuinely compelling story, and there you go. It's a hungry game. It wanted to be the new GTA. And it should have been, really. Sleeping Dogs is a classic from beginning to end. It makes you think of the best legendary HK movies, and it's so much fun right down to the last detail. But, thanks to sales and all that other stuff, no one backed United Front's attempts to make a sequel. And now the studio doesn't even exist anymore. A crying shame. If Hitman Blood Money were a 2010s game, it would be in the top 5. Because it's tantalisingly close to perfect, a brilliant concept, flawlessly executed. How do you follow perfection? Well, if you're IO Interactive, you drop a massive steaming turd called Absolution onto a plate, serve that up and almost kill your golden goose outright. But after doing that, IO did try and make their way back to former glory, and even if the game that's simply called Hitman isn't quite blood money, it was a big leap in the right direction. Back to the open-ended stealth with all the different ways of completing a mission, back to being hidden in plain sight, back to a bunch of missions where you don't simply go through the motions in order to get from A to B, but immerse yourself in every detail, every movement and every clue that can help you. And back in the shoes of who might be gaming's best representation of the cold-blooded, emotionless killer. You are, as ever, Agent 47. Resurrecting Hitman has been a bumpy ride for IO, taking them close to closure, but ultimately, however, it has brought them independence, which hopefully has made it worth doing. Dishonored has perhaps got less of a short shrift than some of the games we've just covered. As a first-person stealth game, it definitely managed to bring the goods for everyone. It satisfied those who like an immersive world in their levels where you have all sorts of things to do, and it actually feels like those actions have an effect on your surroundings. It certainly felt for some, like me, to be a brilliant sequel to the classic Thief games, even if it didn't have much to do with those. Some things the game does, like having items that talk to you or being able to blink into another space, felt like the sort of thing those games could have done if they hadn't turned so sour. And that whole steampunk vibe, well, that was just bloody lovely, wasn't it? It sure seemed as though a lot of games went steampunk after Dishonored. It headed up an unconscious hankering for magnificent contraptions and tortured Victoriana. It didn't exactly put much of a footer on in the end. Probably one of the last Bethesda-led titles you could really say that about. Some games definitely do take the piss a bit. The Messenger starts off as an excellent side-scroller in the vein of classics like Castlevania and Ninja Gaiden, a brilliant ultra-demanding linear experience that just gets better, especially as you learn more complex skills. Then, halfway through, it turns into an open-ended Metroidvania. It allows you to switch between two worlds, one distinctly 8-bit and another more 16-bit. It turns the whole thing on its head and is still pretty bloody good, even if, it doesn't have anything to do with Metroid or Castlevania. The music and presentation are what you would expect for an indie title by now, they're never not good, but the Messenger thrives due to being a master of all classic retro platformer forms, and a jack of none. Another one of this list's more unique experiences, and another that I covered a long time ago. It's a Cold War type game after all, one that feels as though you've been stuck in some film by Krzysztof Kieslowski or Rainer Werner Fassbinder. Manning the Ostotskan border is in and of itself filled with ever more complex tasks as you go over every single one of a hopeful's documents, eager to stamp them so you can earn enough to maintain your living conditions, but desperate not to make too many mistakes. And there's the small matter of a complex plot bubbling under, with many different endings to boot. In short, there are a lot of plates to juggle. It feels too much at times, but then that's how it would feel for this beleaguered Borgda worker. Just put your stern face on, cause no trouble, glory to Ostotska. Next. And here is another incredibly technical experience, it has to be said. As a platformer, Dust Force is crazily intricate. There's so many different ways of cleaning things that it's hard to keep track of all of them, many of them so precise that it's still easy to screw up controlling the thing after playing it for a long time. Dust Force is designed for mastery. It's all about getting those ratings. Being able to S rank or even S plus rank a level is quite an achievement. You've managed to find the most brilliant and the cleanest line all the way through every last spec. Weirdly, as a 2D platformer, it has something of the classic Tony Hawk games about it, through this building of constant little tricks and creating those lines. One of the most sportiest of these games, without a doubt. A fair bit different and a whole lot of excellent. I sometimes wonder if I should preface this by saying that I've never managed to get round to playing any of the Uncharted games. People do seem to compare Tomb Raider 2013 to those a lot. Still, it doesn't matter. After a fair few years of underwhelming work with She of the big handguns and bigger tombs, Crystal Dynamics finally managed to nail Lara Croft with a serious, not exactly double D, but most definitely AAA reboot. Origin stories can sometimes be a bit sketchy and you do wonder just how much a character like Lara Croft needs such a thing, but in the end there's a whole load of fun gunplay and even funner action set pieces, while the whole thing is a total cracker looks-wise. You don't get too many of these to the pound. The only two kind of silly things are having a survival instinct thingy that's straight out of Arkham Asylum and, well, not actually having all that many tombs to explore. Still, I love this game. Max Payne 3 was many, many years in the making. Some weren't so sure about it. What of the comic strip aesthetic? Why does it now all look as though Remedy have been binging on movies by the late great Tony Scott? Has the world-weary character slipped into parody, muttering about how he's got a hole in his second favourite drinking arm? Despite the big change in his fit, it scarcely matters when you play it. Years have gone by and it still doesn't feel like many games have delivered quite the kinetic, full-on third-person experience that this one does. Diving downstairs, going in slow motion, taking those last shots. They certainly didn't change that core, they just improved on it and made one of the most balletic action games ever. Oh, we're certainly full of the good printing words for this tidbit, aren't we? S-fit, kinetic, balletic. All you need to know perhaps is that every shootout in Max Payne 3 just about makes you piss your pants with excitement due to how bloody good and action-packed they are. Still worth playing? Very much so. Some games truly do fill you with determination, don't they? Celeste is all about one woman's spiritual journey to face her fears, climb a mountain, and collect a whole load of strawberries along the way. It's by the brilliant Matt Thorson, who spent quite a long time making hard indie platform games of all shapes and sizes, and this is undoubtedly his masterwork. If you're not familiar with the game, you may possibly look at it and wonder just what separates it from countless other indie platformers with a penchant for pixel art and a tough difficulty level, but it does have a compelling storyline filled with subtexts and themes that resonate, and well, it's just that much more fun to play than a lot of others. Sometimes these deep questions simply come down to something like Matt Thorson being pretty good at making games. Celeste is a brilliant platformer from start to finish, and the soundtrack's amazing too. Well, here's a big one. Some may have perhaps wondered just what I think of Dark Souls or games like Dark Souls. I don't talk about them that much. The answer? Well, it's complicated. I've spent years trying to really get into the game, and every time I seem to get a little bit further. I think that the last time I tried, I did manage to understand it a lot more, even if I'm still dreadful at it, and it is the sort of game you need to dedicate yourself to, meaning I only get worse again with time I spend away from it. As you can see, I've still only really scratched the surface of the game, although a lot of people, to be honest, probably don't even make it here. I certainly didn't the first few times, giving up in sheer frustration. I don't have too much to offer here except my own personal experiences. After all, this is, of course, one of the most influential games of the entire last decade. Gaming would have been completely different had Dark Souls never existed. And slowly but surely I've gotten to a stage where I can certainly do more than just appreciate it, or respect it while being utterly intimidated by its unforgiving difficulty. I'm sure that, someday, I'll learn to truly love it. From one highly influential work to another. It's not like there weren't good or even great superhero games before Batman Arkham Asylum, but Rocksteady's game managed to leave everything else coughing up dust. Even through decent hype before release, I'm not sure how many people thought it was going to be as excellent as it was. It's quite simple what makes these games, really, whether they're in the form of a Metroidvania like this one, or more open world. Essentially, they're simulators. You are Batman. You can do everything he does. Glide everywhere, stealthily disarm the inmates and take them down, assault groups of them with 100 different martial arts styles, use all the gadgets. It's all here. Superhero games often felt like they used to have restrictions on them, with the famous protagonist ending up being a little kneecapped. Perhaps designers thought that if you allowed the player to have a superhero with all of their abilities, as you see in the comics, you might have something of an unbalanced experience. I mean, just look at how poor Superman has suffered over the years. Well, Rocksteady showed this to be a myth. They created a brilliant game with absolutely no restrictions whatsoever on anything that Batman can do, and everyone's been twigging onto that ever since. I've said it before, and I'll say it again, but yeah, if you want a game that takes an old classic kicking and screaming into the new age, look no further. Doom takes elements of the old and makes them feel so perfect and modern. doing something like frantically running around a closed off arena as enemies spawn everywhere with the objective of killing the lot of them is a concept that's decades old, far older even than the FPS genre. And there's few times where it's been so much fun, and so incredibly visceral, to rip and tear through all in your wake to a hammering, screaming metal soundtrack. There's no other shooter quite like this. And after a few times of that, well, you've just fallen in love all over again, haven't you? The new Doom makes you feel just about as giddy as you did the first time you played the old Doom. There's quite a lot of blood in this game too, as it happens. It just tends to be spilled more intimately. Crusader Kings 2 is the only one of the Paradox Grand strategy games that I've played. Perhaps because I have quite an interest in this time period, filled with Dark Ages, Mongol invasions and bubonic plagues? I don't know. Either way, it does the job. It makes you feel like you're running a dynasty. Not necessarily a successful one. There may at points come a time when your name is blessed with a leader who has all the skills, enough to unite a region or perhaps even a whole country under him. He could be a brave general, a diplomatic mastermind, a pious thinker, perhaps even all of those and more. But nothing lasts forever. Inevitably, they die. If you're lucky, they live to a ripe old age with a firm plan in place, but most of the time the Reaper visits suddenly. A stray arrow hits them at the end of an easy battle, they fall off a horse on their morning canter and bonk their head, or a jealous bastard brother slips a rather ugly tonic into their food. And before you know it, suddenly the succession has passed to a fat, flatulent inbred git with more interest in his equally web-footed sister than the affairs of state. What can you do? Easy come, easy go. This truly is an epic game of hills and valleys, and a worthy start to the top 20. Another game from close to the decade's start. Clee Entertainment had turned a few heads previously thanks to games like Shank, a little cartoony, a lot violent, kinda fun and all that. And then they made Mark of the Frickin' Ninja basically out of nowhere. Basically nobody suddenly expected these people to make one of the best 2D stealth games of all time, a definitive ninja title. Whenever I go back to it, I remember how brilliant it is. All that lovely darkness, waiting for the right moment to strike, carefully managing the sound that you make and the footsteps you take, using all the tools at your disposal. It's no surprise that these guys have gone from strength to strength as the years have gone by. There's other games that admittedly I haven't played that people also rather love from these folks, like say Don't Starve. But it's fun to see the moment when a perfectly okay developer suddenly became a seriously brilliant operator. And for these guys, it all started with this instant classic. And now for something completely different and so much more relaxing. Another game that I've already talked about before now, the almighty game of Euro Truck Simulator 2. The game of simply chilling out, putting on a nice radio station, say Radio Veronica from the Netherlands, cruising along and doing a couple of jobs around the continent. Not that things always go according to plan. Being something of a useless driver who has never followed the rules of the road in any game except for this one, at some point I usually end up crashing my vehicle quite badly, requiring many trips to the services. My truck driver avatar is in tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt thanks to my recklessness. Not that they mind. Hell, this trucker here doesn't mind at all that I've just crashed into his vehicle head on at high speed. It's all good. Probably because he's listening to Radar Love too. The relaxation just never stops. Still a bit of an odd game this. It's the cover shooter with perfectly acceptable and fun mechanics that also takes you on a nightmarish and horrifying journey complete with killing your fellow countrymen, post-apocalyptic sandstorms, Are You Still Into It by Mogwai, crazed DJs and demented CIA agents divvying up the blasted remnants of Dubai animals themselves, and some of the most disturbing sights you will find in any game. Now I'm not one that subscribes to the whole meta view of hey, Spec Ops The Line is a purposefully generic and bad game that's made to make you feel bad about playing violent games and that's also novel and why don't you just turn it off and blah 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 and all of that. But it does have a very different energy about it. The sort of thing something like Silent Hill 2 taps into, where the atmosphere and the storytelling reach a certain level that you can really only find in a bloody good video game. Now this one could be controversial. I fancy I still might get some comments from people saying that they turned the video off right here. Something about Gone Home does attract strong opinions on both sides. what can I say? First off, when this came out and I played it, it kind of came at exactly the right time personally. This sort of thing does help when you feel a bit confused and like you're going through another adolescence. Regardless of all that, there is a well-told story kicking around with lots of nice details to pick through alongside the main pull, especially when you first play and you don't really know what you're walking into. Nowadays, I think what I appreciate most about this game is the attention to detail. I love all the little items that Fulbright created. I love the letters and the magazines that are just perfectly 90s. The game has such a strong sense of design right down to the frickin' food you find in the kitchen, yet it's beautifully subtle about all of this, leaving it for you to find instead of sticking a big sign marked 1995 in your face. Perhaps this is appropriate. Around 2013 I was all about the big emotional moments, the ultra-gay story and the weepy sing-alongs to Heavens to Betsy and Bratmobile. In 2020 all of that fades and I take pleasure in that which is utterly mundane. It's all very nice and comfortable now. This is a very recent addition to the list. Hell, I'm kind of playing through this game right now, a couple of years after everyone went absolutely mad for it. There's a lot of good to say about Undertale. I enjoy the bullet hell style fights and the opportunity to spare everyone who I come across, but I think mostly I quite admire how it all comes together. In the main, as this video surely demonstrates, it's hard to be funny. It's especially hard for games to be funny. Undertale manages it. It's the funniest game I've played in many a year, and at an incredibly fast pace too. Seriously, it's properly laugh a minute. A lot of people have undoubtedly wrote very detailed and chin-strokey articles trying to explain why Undertale gets its whole story and mood so damn right. But, well, it all just comes out of love, doesn't it? You can't do parody this well unless you love what you're nailing, and you actually create a good proper plot to go along with it. We've had some right good video game storytelling, especially in this bit of the list, and I think this might be the closest we've got to something like Airplane. It's got me, and it's got me good. This could very easily have been Arkham Asylum. There's not an awful lot that separates Asylum and City. Honestly, it usually depends on the one that I've played last, and for this list, just so happens to be City. Asylum obviously did most of the groundwork, with all the fighting and the predatoring and gadgeting and general Batmaning, but the whole thing works just as well if not even better inside something that's far more open world, although not as much as the series would get later on. It's a stunning game to look at, of course, but gliding around this prison island is special. It's got just the right amount of distractions away from a solid main story, while also improving on some of Asylum's weaker points, such as boss fights. Not bad considering how freaking good the original was. Bastion could so easily have been a bloody annoying game. What with the world that builds itself, the rather odd mix of folksy aesthetics with more Japanese stylings, and of course, the endless narration. It would only take one of Bastion's many gimmicks to fail and the game would most certainly not be here. Somehow though, they all ended up fitting like a charm. It's even perhaps the only game ever to do a good job of what at one point dismissively became known as Radio Voice of God. The actual gameplay of isometric sort of dungeon crawling, sort of fighting, sort of RPGing acts as a very nice base for all of these more creative and gimmicky flourishes, and it pretty instantly made this a top title, long before you got to Sinalon to build that wall. Now, it's a very tight fit, but VVVVVV was released on 11th of January 2010, which just about makes it eligible for this top 50. It's a game I've talked about many times. I'm sure I'd be repeating myself if I wondered again what to call it, or talked passionately about Veni Vidi Vici and how rewarding an achievement it is to get through that bit. Sometimes though, a lot of the fun in the game is spent just drifting along. The whole flipping from floor to ceiling gimmick certainly comes alive in the game's overworld, when you're going from screen to screen in search of trinkets and levels. Even when you're not going through the actual levels and trying not to die all that much, it's still bloody awesome. What a game. And Terry Kavanagh's a thoroughly bloody nice bloke to boot. Another very recent addition to this list. I got this game on the most recent Steam sale, having been curious about it for quite a while. Somewhat unusually for a title I bought in the sales, I booted it up almost immediately and, well, I was hooked right from the off. Horizon Chase Turbo is a flawless, brilliant arcade racer, an absolute love letter to those who love the old ways, in particular Lotus and Top Gear. There's a whole world of tracks and cars to race against here, and the action's so rip-roaringly fast and smooth. It's so far ahead of any modern bloated monster of a car game that they may as well not exist. And Aquaris, the brilliant Brazilians who made the game, enlisted none other than Barry Leach to provide a soundtrack to stand up there with any classic racer. Not that you would expect any less from the man who composed songs for a whole load of said classic games, but there you go. I cannot recommend this game enough. It absolutely will make you fall in love with arcade racing all over again. Okay, it's top 10 time. And it's another famous one to start, another game I've certainly waxed lyrical about before. Good old Shovel Knight. It's not exactly a surprise to anyone that it would be so high up, seeing as it is one of the best games of its NES-loving kind. Over the years, the folks at Yacht Club have only kept on adding to it as well, to the point where playing this now could literally mean hundreds of hours trying to do everything. I've never quite got to that point with Shovel Knight, but it's amazing regardless. Funnily enough, I've never considered myself too big on the games that it would probably consider its main inspiration, your Mega Mans and what have you, or your DuckTales. And yet I love this and have no end of fun swinging my glorious tool at anything in my way, all in the name of chivalry. What a game! I was perfectly happy with Fire Pro Returns being the final time we'd see the king of all wrestling games. Or rather, I'd certainly made my peace with it being the last one. It's not like there would be much chance of a small developer like Spike making such a niche game again, after all. And then, well, this came out of the blue. It's Fire Pro. It's back. And obviously it's in my top 10. As is the case with all of these games, it's taken hundreds of hours of my life. Thanks to the creations on the workshop, FPW finally allows a truly infinite world of wrestling, past and present, real or imaginary, celebrity or politician, animal, vegetable or mineral, anything you can think of. It's limitless. The formula is of course the same as ever, and perfect for someone like me. I can just spend ages simming away, throwing folks in at random, putting together dream matches, playing with a made-up federation. That's what I do. I've played for hundreds of hours, and have controlled precisely 0 matches. I'm perfectly happy with this because it's still the most satisfying, most accurate, and most passionate simulation of the art of wrestling that there is. Intoxicating, feverish 1980s dreams aplenty? Or is it just a game made by people who watched Drive way too much? Either way, Hotline Miami is another game that's kind of obvious for the top 10. It ticks a lot of Kim Justice boxes. 1980s and Drive are 2 of those, and, well, let's see, we've got strange music, we've got super fast gameplay, challenging difficulty, we've got lovely white suits, plenty of colours, and, yes, of course, we have utterly gratuitous violence. Bludgeoned heads, bullet-ridden bodies, slit throats, burnt faces, all in the name of fulfilling cryptic contracts and moving along a strange yet utterly compelling plot. Another game that kind of came out of nowhere to be a classic, my experience was the same as others. As soon as you start playing, you can't think of much else it reminds you of. Something entirely new. Little things like just playing a bit of it for the purpose of this list. It's so easy to get pulled back in. We said that anything exotic was like something on acid back in the 90s, never realising that ultimately, that cliche was just made for Hotline Miami. Until people started singing this game's praises, Far Cry hadn't interested me all that much. Never really fancied it. Until this absolutely hooked me to the point of just about doing everything possible in it. It's the ever so slightly meta account of a young American man's spiritual journey through an exotic foreign island, with thousands utterly butchered in the process. At its best, Godless was glorious. Scoping out a base, marking all the soldiers for death, shooting out a tiger cage with a sniper rifle and watching all of them get mauled, setting entire swaths of jungle on fire. It was a bloody romp. Can you really buy this young American man as being essentially the Predator? Before too long, yeah, he fits. And while the plot wasn't exactly perfect, it did feature one of the greatest antagonists in video game history. It gave us farce. Oh, and there's also the rather cool DLC that's all super neon 80s and Michael Biehn and all that, even if it's not a patch on the main game. Far Cry 3 was so bloody great, Ubisoft Montreal have basically been remaking the damned thing ever since. Absolutely belter. There's very few platformers that I consider to be at the level of Super Meat Boy full stop, let alone just ones that were made in the 2010s. Another one of those games that took over my life for a bit. I played it all the way through an Xbox Live Arcade and became a golden god, and I've played for a pretty hefty chunk of it on PC too. It's all I've ever wanted in a platform game really. Ultra quick levels, ultra fast speed, and a whole lot of challenge. That'll do me nicely. There's some other indie games, things like N+, for example, that kinda laid the groundwork before this game came out, but Super Meat Boy perfected the formula, and I'll never be able to truly get enough of it. Whether it's taking a simple little run through a light salt factory, sweating your way through dark hell, stumbling onto the glitch levels, unlocking characters, or seeing just how quickly you can make it through those last levels, it's always the best bloody thing. I have played this game for years. In fact, I first played Spelunky back when it was a freeware title with a bit more of an 8-bit bent, and I absolutely loved it back then. Needless to say, I greeted the news of its souped-up release in 2012 with joy, and yeah, I've kept on playing it. And in all this time, I've still never beaten the damned thing. But that doesn't really matter. Playing it still always feels so fresh, like I'm entering some strange machine where anything could happen and anything is likely to. As soon as you put a foot on, you can set off a ridiculous chain of events that could very likely lead to your death. Or hell, maybe you don't even have to put a foot on. You could trigger such a thing purposefully and then just ride the wave. I don't know of many games quite like Spelunky that are such a well-oiled contraption where it feels like every last bit of a level is utterly connected with each other. And this is in a game that randomly generates the damn things. God bless Derek Yu and his genius. So, here's my Downwell story. I was randomly fooling around watching videos last year and came across a new one by Jim Sterling where he was playing this on Switch. I kinda click on his vids half the time, because he does make a lot of them, but I stopped on this one. The game looked quite fun. You fall down a well, you try and rescue your cat, and you've got stompy boots that shoot bullets. Sounds right up my street. Turned out I already had it on Steam, probably bought yonks ago in some humble bundle or whatever. I started playing it and yep, that was it. Downwell took over for a good couple of months. It's that frickin' addictive to fall through this ever-changing well, slowly getting more and more of a knack for dealing with all its different enemies. It's also hard. It took that long not only to reach the end, but to finally beat the boss after many attempts. Perhaps one of my most satisfying gaming moments ever, that was. From the wonderful, mostly black and white palette and awesome chip soundtracks, but mainly to some of the most playable and intense action I have ever experienced, Downwell is perfect. And you know what's even better? All of this could be yours too, for £2. Little more than the cost of a 2-litre bottle of Pepsi Max buys you this. I will say it again, absolutely perfect game. I couldn't possibly recommend it enough. Cheers, Jim. This one was a very glaring omission when I did my all-time top 100 this time last year. Somehow I just forgot to include Rocket League entirely. Well, here's an opportunity to fix that. From looking at this list, it's pretty easy to see that I don't usually go for multiplayer in games at all. It's just not really my thing. But this game? Well, for this game I make a rather large exception. Rocket League is the most addictive and flat-out best multiplayer game I have ever played. Such a simple, brilliant little thing that, thanks to the constant need for positional awareness and the end-to-end play, actually does feel a fair bit like playing football. It feels more like playing football than most of the current modern-day bloody FIFA games do. Only, of course, it has rocket-powered cars. I've had a lot of fun with Rocket League over the years, including the odd drunken late-night sessions straight back from the pub and suddenly feeling like playing a few matches. It's a total blinder. Best multiplayer game ever. Until recently, it seemed like this would be one of the last proper games that Valve would ever do, busy as they are with running Steam and making tons of money. Portal 2 wouldn't have been exactly a bad thing to go out on. I mean, they nailed it. It's no mean feat making such a great follow-up to one of the greatest games of all time. Taking what the original Portal did and expanding it into a fuller, standalone title, it could have easily gone so wrong. But the general brilliance of thinking with portals, the hilarious characters and the plot, this weird, ever-changing warehouse of eternal testing, it's a winner in every possible way. Portal 1 and 2 completely changed the whole game when it came to puzzling things out, especially in first person. It's crazy to think how many things wouldn't be around if these games didn't exist, and that's why Portal 2 came very close to number 1. But in the end, yeah, it was always going to be Binding of Isaac Rebirth. It's funny, I did play a fair bit of the original Binding of Isaac, but I can't say I ever fancied it too much. Still, I was curious enough to buy Rebirth on a whim and see what a cleaned up Isaac would be like. And that was it. All over. Hooked. Hundreds of hours on this path, making my way through these depths, seeing just what I can end up with. Even eventually having the satisfaction of a totally game-breaking one that went all the way to Mega Satan. I haven't done everything in Rebirth, but I've done most things. Perhaps the most addictive thing I've ever played, Ed McMillan's game, his second entry into the top 10 no less, is awesomely grotesque, so rancidly putrid in its aesthetic, and so bloody impossible to put down once you start running it. The game isn't necessarily at its best when you get that game-breaking build, however. It's when you push through despite getting bad beats. You have moments when the whole thing looks like it's going to go to shit, but you scrape through until suddenly another item begins the turnaround. You take what looked like a bad one and win it all the way to victory against the Blue Baby, or the Lamb, or even Mega Satan, whatever path you choose to take. It's moments like that which make Binding of Isaac Rebirth not just the best game of the 2010s, but my all-time favourite PC game. To be honest, it's not even close. Just don't bother with Afterbirth. At all. And that's it. We're done with this top 50. The 2010s are officially in the books, and we move on to a new decade, originally titled the 2020s, no doubt filled with happiness and joy in the hearts of all good people. Thankfully, the dry month of January is nearly over, so now we move on and get on with other things, such as at last the second half of System 3. Why don't you join me for that video? Join me. Bye for now. Thanks so much for watching this little video. If you like it, please do like it, please interact with my awesome comment section, have a look at my social media in the description, and if you really like the stuff, hey, maybe you want to pledge to my Patreon, where you could join this awesome group of people here. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Andy Cat, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D, Zalior, Remwan Sutter, Dave Cork, David Rose, Dinty, 76538, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunthef, Ian Roberts, James Brown, Jason Stevens, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Mateus Gramzov, Martin Pataki, Potter Margel, Renby Mon, Rusty Kelly, Samir Alamar, Seth Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, The Geeky Dad, Tim Wald, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of the community, thank you so much, and bye for now. Take care.